Our next presentation is on NL 400.
All right, thank you very much, sir. So, like I was saying, it's a little odd that I will start today because I think normally we would go in the logical progression, starting with our plebe class and then working on up. So I'll begin with a quick introduction of where we hope the midshipmen are by the time they come to NL 400, what we're hoping they have gotten from their previous 3 classes in lead in the hall before they come to us. And so what we are looking for is this first class midshipman who comes to us with an intentional moral compass, right? Something that they have put some thought into. It's not just their baseline. They're not just operating on their conditioning and their raising. They have put some thought into who am I as a moral, ethical person. We hope that they have the beginnings of some sort of a personal leadership philosophy, right? Who am I? Who am I as a leader? How do I want to lead sailors and Marines? We hope that they're driven by a keen sense of self, something that we really expect them to get out of their plebe level class. Group chemistry, okay. We hope that they come to us with that understanding of what we call the constitutional paradigm, right? The way our differing loyalties as active duty members pull us in different directions and what obligations we owe to each. We hope they come to us with an understanding of the classic schools of ethical thought that are going to be driving those personal leadership philosophies, driving their internal moral compass. And then we want to add on to all of those things, onto that foundation in NL 400, the lens of legal context, right? What are my constraints and how does the law empower me? And we want to give them a deeper understanding of the Constitution, right? That big document that they're about to raise their right hand and pledge their unwavering loyalty to. We want them to understand that, both how it limits them and how it empowers them as American citizens and as junior officers in the fleet. All right, so that's kind of where we're at starting NL 400. And sir, if you wouldn't mind, I misspoke. There, Dr. Rao is right. The last slide, I think, is the one that gives us kind of our NL 400. Yeah, so here is kind of the breakdown of our course, and I'll walk through it a little bit. So we divide the class in thirds, roughly. We spend the first third talking about military justice. So how do we make a court-martial come into being? That's one of the, quite frankly, less interesting aspects of what we do. But we talk about crimes and defenses. And then throughout all of that, we talk about how the Constitution shapes criminal law. So we're going to talk about your Fourth and your Fifth Amendment rights, things that are actually really important that they understand as junior officers, right? Who one day will be questioning Seaman Timmy about why he's 3 hours late to work. We're going to need to understand how we can do that legally and ethically. We're going to talk too about the tension between the Constitution and some of our rules and articles in the UCMJ. So how does the First Amendment act as this counter pressure to some of our restrictions on speech, on free exercise of religion, on things like that? So that's our first third of the course. Basically, I need you to understand what the law is so that we can start talking about what we can do with it. Any questions on that part of things so far? No? All right, and then we move into what we're calling administrative law. So we'll talk about all of the different administrative tools available to a commander and to a junior officer in order to help Seaman Timmy start conforming his behavior to expected behavior, right? So we'll talk about administrative consequences for bad actions. We'll talk about things that we can do to help enhance your behavior, right? So extra military instruction, things like that. We'll spend a lot of time talking about what we call command investigations. So in the military, we have NCIS. You guys, I'm sure, all know about that from having seen the TV show, right? But we also have a couple other ways that we investigate crimes in the Navy and the Marine Corps. We have CID, which investigates like our misdemeanor level crimes, like NCIS, but with less money. And then we don't call either of those guys for some of the more low level misconduct. For those, it's actually going to be my students next year, right, walking the halls of their command, and Skipper's going to say, hey, you, have I got a job for you? And that junior officer is going to go out and investigate a crime. They're going to take statements from witnesses. They're going to find evidence and documentation on it and write a report. So because we know that that's going to be an expectation for them out in the fleet, we help them understand how to do an investigation like that well, how to format it so that they don't embarrass themselves to their bosses, and how to do it ethically, right? How do you explain Seaman Timmy his rights? It's not just you slap the form down in front of him, right? You want to make sure that he understands that. And we do that because it's the right thing to do. Finally, once we kind of help them understand all of these different legal tools, then we talk about how they are actually leadership tools for them, right? And we start building on that personal legal philosophy. So some of these tools are available to them even at the like ensign, lieutenant, JG level. And we start talking about how are you going to apply these tools out in the fleet? What kind of a leader do you want to be? And as part of that, we have a couple lectures that we call Leadership in Law. And we bring out somebody, a line officer who has served a command tour, to talk about how they used these tools as a commanding officer. How did it help them correct sailor behavior, serve good order and discipline, those kinds of things. I also like to bring in a junior officer to do the same thing. So I bring in a Marine who has done a tour leading a platoon of Marines, right, and talk about how he used these tools as well. So they get the junior and the senior perspective. As part of that, we spend a good deal of time talking about understanding their own philosophy, but also understanding Seaman Timmy. Because Seaman Timmy is going to come to you with a different background than you, a different set of expectations and understandings. And we're going to want you to communicate with him to get to the bottom of why he's acting the way that he is so that you can use the most appropriate legal tool. After administrative law, then we move into what our students probably find to be the most interesting portion of our course. So we talk about operational law. And some of that is, yeah, a pretty boring day, honestly, on maritime regimes and what law applies in what body of water type stuff. But then we also dive into the more nuanced ideas of the law of armed conflict and rules of engagement. We spend some time talking about the history and the development of those things so that we understand their rational underpinnings, making it easier for the students to internalize, right? How do I make these decisions when I'm in these life or death, complicated but also ethical situations? So as part of this, I, at the end of the semester, do a class where I teach a unit about the Third Reich and about war crimes and violations of LOAC there. And I spend the majority of that class talking about this one particular reserve unit that was going through Poland and massacring people. Just these ordinary guys.
Yeah.
Who end up, I see you, ma'am, nodding along, who end up in this situation. And we talk then about what one of my main themes for the course is, which is do the right thing no matter what it costs you. So throughout each of these units, right, we will be drawing on stories about usually commanders, but sometimes ordinary folks who found themselves in a situation where they chose not to do the right thing. And we'll talk about, the whys of that and how important it is to do the right thing. That's why as a commander, you get command pay. And that's why our fighting force expects, even junior officers to be able to make these life and death decisions, to be the one guy out of 500 who raises their hand saying, no, thank you, I don't want to murder women and children today. So we talk about that. And then our very last class in all sections is what we call our multi-dimensional decision-making scenario. So we pull in one of our professors from the 200 level ethics class, and we team teach a scenario, right? We put them in a situation where they are boots on ground. They've been given this order, which is illegal, but you can understand how people would rationalize that order. Basically, it's to start double tapping people. If you've shot someone, they're wounded, go ahead and shoot them again, just to be sure. And so we talk about both the legal principles that tell you you should not do that thing, but also the ethical principles that should be driving your decision to not pull the trigger, to not follow that illegal order. And then, okay, so you're faced with this illegal order. how do you deal with it? What are you expected to do as an officer in the Marine Corps or the Navy to go up the chain of command and say, hey, I have concerns about this order? So that is our class in a nutshell. What questions does anybody have? Oh, and thank you, Dr. Rao, for correcting my acronym. I try very hard not to talk like a lawyer.
I had a quick question. Thanks very much. It was really fascinating. So I'm thinking about the current environment and the influence of modern topics on not the law necessarily, but the implementation of it. And where or how do we talk about diversity within the execution of the structures that we have?
Oh, ma'am, I love that question so much. So, and it's kind of two questions, so I'll address both of them. To your question about current events, absolutely. All of my faculty and myself are super engaged on how do we bring current events into the classroom. My students have to read a news article for every single class that we do that is pulled from the headlines about that day's topic. And so that's one way. I'll tell you, with everything that's been going on lately, I think almost all of my instructors, self-included, ditched an entire class period. Hey, we'll make this up. We'll squish other things together. And we spent an entire day talking about the current environment. We talked about disparities in justice based on race, right? There's statistical evidence that bears that out. So we talked about that. We talked about how that informs our military experience. There is a survey or a study out there that suggests that there are disparities in the armed forces, in the administration of military justice, and some of those administrative correction tools. So we talked about that. We talked about a couple leaders, particularly some Air Force leaders at the time last week, had put out really great, authentic leadership statements. So that's some of us pulling in those earlier threads, right? How do you be an authentic leader? How do you bring your personal experience to things? So we talked about all those things. And then we talked about, the use of force at home, what our left and right limits on that would be, to kind of steer our students to, here's your understanding of the legal constraints that are at play in this situation. So that's how we talked about that on that discrete topic. Last spring semester, sort of similarly, when COVID-19 came out, there was a bunch of discussion about the possibility for the Insurrection Act to get invoked then on a different thing to try to enforce a quarantine and things of that nature. So again, and I kind of pulled my students, hey, do you want to talk about this? They said, yeah. So we spent, I think, 25 minutes talking about the law as it relates to federal power and separation of authorities and who's responsible for what, the state versus us, the National Guard, who are they, what do they do? So we talked about that kind of stuff. So we are dynamic and we will stop everything for something major like this. But in our standard, ordinary life, really, we're more just pulling in that occasional article to talk about, hey, here's this real life example of this thing happening. What does it mean for you? A good example would be, I'm sure most of you have heard of the Central Park Five. There's actually another case study about the Norfolk Four. And so we talk about that in my class because I think it helps drive it home for them, because it is home, right? This isn't our house. These are four sailors that confessed to something that they didn't do. So we talk about current events in that way. To your question about how we talk about diversity and those things, that's actually ever present in our class. In almost every day, I would say we're talking about something related to that. I'm teaching today due process and when your command can take away your privileges and things like that, right? So garden variety stuff. When can I give you a curfew? When can I give you extra military instruction because you're bad at your job? As part of that, I'm going to talk about the Supreme Court case called Frontiero. Frontiero is a landmark Supreme Court case argued by my girl, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she is responsible for me getting paid the same as Captain McInerney, who is here in our meeting, in terms of me getting BAH for my dependents, just the same as he gets BAH for his dependents. So we talk about sort of those notions of equality and diversity in our ranks. I spend a great deal of time talking about sexual harassment in what I think is a meaningful and different way than we talk about it at our big old Navy trainings, right? We get into the nuts and bolts of why, this is bad for unit cohesion and what you can and cannot do. Because I think non-lawyers who give those briefs are often afraid to talk about the real left and right limits. And so we talk about that. But we also spend a lot of time talking about your Marines are going to come from a very different background than you. As part of that multi-factor decision-making scenario that we were talking about earlier, your Marines may 100% believe that this order is good to go. This is what I want to do. These guys have been hurting me and my buddies. I'm going to double tap everybody. Okay, how do you reach that Marine who comes from that very different environment from you and bring them on board with what you want to do? And that's been applicable recently, right, in conversations about race. You are going to have sailors and Marines with different experiences than you as a leader, including those who were raised thinking that some of that language is okay. And how do you, as that junior officer, make that stuff stop? Yeah. What else?
Thank you.
I was fascinated to hear you're talking about Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning, I think.
Yes.
I'm in the history department, and I have used that book in The West in the Modern World. And a question, this is a question that I posed for them to write in an essay is, how do ordinary men become desensitized killers?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer or the justification at the Nuremberg trials, which I make my midshipmen grapple with, is I was just following orders.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
and it's very interesting to hear their comments about that. And I asked them, in your leadership courses, do you know the difference between a legal and an illegal order? And how would you respond?
And they will by the time they get through my class. Although depending on what year students you're teaching, they may not have, particularly because it's our last big substantive section. I kind of do the shot over the bow in the beginning, like, hey, just so you know, when we're teaching about orders violations, you don't have to follow an unlawful order, but then we don't really get into the heart of it to the end. And what I think is fascinating about that book too, and I put quotations up on the screen. So yes, their defense was following orders, but in Ordinary Men, they really press these guys like, still, why? And they'll make their justifications or their rationalizations. Some of it was greed. Some of them just admit like, well, I wanted to promote and I wanted a career, so I went along.
Right.
But I think watching their faces while you go through that is really something. And I have found that when I teach that section before the multi-factor decision-making scenario, we kind of they come into the room very much like, this is not okay, and how do we move forward? And when I don't, they come in a little more 50-50 on that order, and then we have to work through it.
Thank you.
Liz, if I could add one thing, that we across the courses remind our midshipmen about the oath of office, which is obviously a significant commitment that they make to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But what we necessarily have to remind them of is that the oath of office from a midshipman or an officer is different than the oath of office for an enlisted person. And for those of you who don't know, the enlisted oath of office is that they will obey the orders of the President of the United States and the orders of the officers appointed over them. And that has two parts that I want the midshipmen to understand is when they give an order, their enlisted personnel, their oath is to follow that order. And so therefore, when they administer an oath of office to an enlisted person, they are taking on themselves a huge burden. And that burden is to ensure that the orders that they give are lawful and correct. Because the enlisted personnel is only obligated to follow those orders. It is not, they are not obligated by that oath to critique and evaluate. And, so they have to understand, and they have to start out by assuming, that the order is in fact a lawful order. So this is a very important thing that we want them to understand, that the oath of office is very important, and it is different between the officer and enlisted.
Yes, sir. That's a really great point. And actually, as part of that lecture on the Third Reich, I throw the oath of the Army oath from Germany from like 1933 up on the board, and it's not identical to our oath, but it is very, very similar. And I'm like, hey, what does this look like to you? Oh, it looks like ours. And then I throw the oath up that was changed after Hitler came into power, and instead of being obligated to the Constitution and to like the ideals of the nation, now we are obligated to one man.
Yeah.
It's unwavering loyalty, right? Like to the death. I'm not going to remember the exact language. So we talk about the meaning of that and then bring it back to their oath, right? What are you loyal to? The Constitution, to America. That's, to our ideals and values. Good point.
If I could just jump in real quick too, it's a really interesting combination because if we think about law as a field of applied ethics, so to speak, there's always a back and forth between ethics and the law, and you really see that in the oath. When I graduated way back when in 1991, we took the oath in the stadium, and then I went back to Bancroft Hall and went to my company officer and said, what you did in the stadium didn't really count. What really counts is signing this commissioning document. And in some ways, I think he was trying to be wiser than I was at the time, which was not hard to do. But it kind of goes to the back and forth between the fields, basically, that the oath it's really fascinating in some ways. It's a profoundly, what I would describe as it's a moral act, but it's certainly very closely associated with the legal structures that support it. And in my class in 203, we talk about why are we so special? Why do we have to be so dramatic to raise our hands and do all these things? But I think these acts, whether it's signing the paper or raising our hands and verbally speaking it, the commitment that we have in front of the community, they're mutually reinforcing, and there's a lot of wisdom in having these different ways of approaching the interlocking realities, and they're very, very very helpful. So just a way to think about the relationship between our ethics course and the law course, and I think it's kind of a bit of a paradigm probably for all the different disciplines, is that there's a relationship between them, and it's helpful to identify them and then explicitly articulate the differences in how things relate to the students.
Absolutely, sir. I thought I saw maybe a hand, one more hand that had a question. Okay, well that's all I have for you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for letting me share what we're doing. We're very excited about it, and anytime we get to talk about it with our colleagues is really great, so thank you.
Well, thanks very much for participating. We appreciate the insights into the NL 400 course, the fourth of the four courses in the leadership curriculum.